What makes a child beg for mercy and one day refuse to offer it to others? Criminal psychology has long sought to understand the terrifying transformation of affection-starved children into emotionless killers. Inside every case of juvenile aggression, there are hidden codes of trauma, suppressed needs, and a cry for love that was never answered. But how does the fragile mind of a child, desperate for validation and warmth, evolve into a profile of psychological detachment and lethal behavior? Today, you'll witness the unraveling of a case that shook even seasoned forensic psychologists. It starts not with blood, but with silence. A silence so deep, so consistent, that it became the loudest scream for help. The kind of silence that leaves deep emotional scars and creates patterns of behavior rooted in childhood trauma. This is not just about the crime. It's about the inner mechanisms of a disturbed mind, a forensic study of what happens when society looks away. This boy didn't grow up with violence on his mind. He grew up with questions, with fear, with the unbearable absence of affection. He didn't start as a criminal. He was shaped into one. Neglect, emotional rejection, and the normalization of cruelty within his own home didn't just hurt him, they rewired his brain. Psychology forensic reports later revealed indicators of conduct disorder in early stages, but no one took action. His teachers missed the signs. His neighbors whispered but never intervened. At home, what should have been a space of love and security became a battlefield of psychological warfare. Behind every calculated act of violence lies a childhood moment when pain replaced love, a moment when a child learns not to feel, not to trust, not to expect comfort. And in that emotional void, a dark identity is formed. The young boy you're about to learn about was once just like many others, quiet, observant, misunderstood, until the day he stopped asking for love and started punishing the world for not giving it to him. This is not a horror story. This is a psychological dissection. As we go deeper into this case, we'll uncover the critical moments that marked his psychological development, the behavioral red flags that were ignored, and the emotional triggers that led to his first violent outburst. Through the lens of criminal psychology, you'll understand not only what he did, but why he did it. But before we dive deeper into this dark and revealing story, I want to ask you something. Have you ever looked at a child and wondered what secrets they might be hiding behind their silence? Would you know how to recognize the early signs of a disturbed mind? If you're as intrigued by the shadows of the human psyche as we are, make sure to subscribe to the channel. Your engagement is what keeps these psychological case studies alive and brings more stories like this to the surface. And tell me in the comments, do you believe a lack of love can truly turn a child into a killer? Let's begin. He was born into a world that never truly saw him. From the very beginning, there were no celebrations, no arms welcoming him with tenderness, no voices saying his name with joy, just a cold room, tired eyes, and the distant echo of responsibilities that should have never fallen on his tiny shoulders. In criminal psychology, this is known as emotionally inert beginnings, a type of abandonment that isn't physical, but just as violent. The absence of bonding in early years can become the silent origin of a deviant mind. And it was in that silence that he grew. The first records of his childhood describe a quiet, withdrawn boy who preferred the corners of the room rather than playing with the other children. Teachers wrote notes in reports. Introverted behavior, vacant stare, one-word answers. None of them saw it for what it was, a cry for help. In forensic psychology, this is called early affective disconnection, a sign that the brain is building defenses against an environment that offers no emotional security. He didn't know how to name what he felt, but he felt it all, in excess. At home, the maternal figure was more a shadow than an embrace. The father, absent both in presence and purpose, appeared only to enforce rules through yelling or long stretches of silence. Physical touch was rare, affection non-existent, eye contact void of tenderness. It's in this kind of family structure that the foundations are laid for what newspapers years later would call a cold mind. But he wasn't cold, not yet. Inside him pulsed the desperate need to be accepted, to be seen, to hear the words, "I love you," which never came. By age 5, he started talking to his toys. He created stories where he was the hero, the chosen one, the boy finally loved. Child psychologists affirm that this is common in children suffering from emotional deprivation, but when those stories begin to include suffering, revenge, or imagined punishments, the red flags should be immediate. No one noticed. No one was listening. His childhood was a sequence of identical days, where punishment came in the form of silence and rewards. Well, there were no rewards. The drawings started at age 6. Crooked lines, isolated figures, eyes always large and sad. The human forms he created often had mouths sewn shut or covered by hands. At first glance, they looked like nothing more than a child's wild imagination. But for those who understand criminal psychology, every line hid an unspoken wound. Drawings are an extension of the mind, and in that extension there was pain, abandonment, and a fear that had no name, a fear of being forgotten, of existing without meaning. He sought attention in the subtlest ways. He would knock over cups on purpose, slam doors without reason, cry over minor issues just to hear someone say his name. Even then, all he got in return was irritation or indifference. The authority figures in his life were either absent or excessively authoritarian, with no balance, no warmth, no connection. This isn't theory. It's a constant pattern in the stories of children who develop deviant psychological profiles. When affection is denied, the brain finds other ways to cope, and almost never are those ways safe. At school, he became known as the weird kid. He had no friends, avoided physical contact, and reacted poorly to any approach. One time, he shoved a classmate just because she touched his notebook. He was suspended, but no adult asked why he reacted that way. No one questioned what that notebook meant to him, and perhaps inside that notebook were the first clues of what was to come years later. Because in that notebook, he controlled the story. He was heard. He existed. At 7, he stopped talking to his toys. They were replaced by absolute silence, not shyness, resignation. The resignation of expecting love from a world that only gave him neglect. That kind of resignation, according to behavioral neuroscience, can profoundly alter emotional pathways in the brain. The amygdala, responsible for emotional reactions, begins to respond with aggression instead of empathy, not by choice, but because it's the only language the environment has taught. His days became mechanical cycles. Wake up, go unnoticed, obey, get punished, sleep. A developing child's mind should never become familiar with the repetition of abandonment, but his did, and it was inside that emotionally barren routine that the first signs of desensitization appeared. Dead animals in the backyard, a subtle smile when a classmate cried, a fascination with violent stories. Nothing individually alarming, but together, they form what experts identify as the early construction of a child's psychopathic profile. Nights were the worst. While other children dreamed, he simply relived the day, the insults, the silent punishments, the hollow looks. He would close his eyes, but never find rest. He slept curled up with his arms around his body, as if he were the only one left to offer himself comfort. And so he grew, without hearing bedtime stories, without ever being told he was safe, without ever being told he was loved. That's the danger. When a child grows up without any references of love, they may become incapable of recognizing or offering affection. Criminal psychology does not excuse this, but it explains it. Because behind every brutal act, there's almost always an equally brutal absence. Today, looking back at his childhood records, analysts can piece together the puzzle. But back then, he was just another quiet kid. Just that. A face in the crowd, a name on a cold attendance list, a number in a forgotten statistic. But for those who knew how to listen, he was already screaming, and no one heard. That's the most disturbing truth in the psychological profile of future criminals. They almost always leave signs. They draw their trauma. They speak through behavior. But if no one is watching closely, it all becomes invisible. And it was in that invisibility that he stayed, until the day he decided to do something no one could ignore. And when he did, the whole world saw him. But by then, it was too late to save him, or to save anyone else. Now we move into the next phase, the part where silence turns into reaction, the part where the boy stops asking for help and begins to retaliate. There comes a moment in every neglected child's life when silence turns into something else. In his case, it started with a bruise that no one asked about. It wasn't the first, but it was the first that made him flinch when the teacher touched his shoulder. She paused, unsure, and then moved on. That hesitation, that decision to stay silent, was the beginning of the pattern that would follow him into every institution meant to protect. The school became another place where he was seen, but not truly noticed. Psychologists refer to this phase as environmental reinforcement of invisibility, when both the home and the social surroundings ignore the child's emotional and physical needs. The child's brain learns that pain is normal, expected, and perhaps even deserved. At home, the punishments escalated. The rules became stricter, the consequences more brutal, and the justifications more absurd. A broken glass led to days without food. Speaking out of turn triggered a slap so hard it disoriented him. The psychological abuse was worse than the physical. He was told daily that he was a burden, that he ruined his mother's life, that if he disappeared, no one would care. These aren't just cruel words. They are neuropsychological wounds. The child's self-concept is formed through repeated verbal messaging, and his messages were always the same. You're nothing. You're unwanted. You're a mistake. He began to dissociate during these episodes. Not all children who experience trauma develop dissociation, but for those who do, it becomes a way to survive unbearable environments. His eyes would glaze over, his breathing would slow, and he would mentally leave the room as his body endured the abuse. This detachment from physical reality is not just a coping mechanism. It's a precursor to emotional compartmentalization. The part of the mind that feels empathy begins to disconnect. The ability to perceive others' pain fades, not because he's cruel, but because pain was never acknowledged in his world. How can you care about someone else's suffering when your own was never validated? By the age of 9, his drawings changed. Gone were the sad faces and silenced mouths. Now there were knives, shadows, and bleeding figures. One picture depicted a child with red scribbles around the head, standing over an adult figure with X's for eyes. When asked about it, he said it was from a dream, but it wasn't. It was a fantasy, a new coping strategy emerging, a shift from passive survival to imagined control. In the language of forensic behavioral analysis, this is the beginning of aggressive ideation. Violent thoughts are not random. They form slowly, often in children who feel powerless for too long. His teachers grew concerned, but concern doesn't equal action. The school system filed a few reports, made a call or two, then forgot. He was still showing up. He was still breathing. That was enough for them. But inside, he was breaking in ways that would never be repaired. His environment gave him nothing to hold on to. No adult role model, no friend, no escape. He started spending more time alone, not because he liked solitude, but because interaction brought more danger than comfort. This is where the foundation for antisocial behavior is laid, not in evil, but in exhaustion. At home, a new boyfriend entered the picture. Another man, another source of volatility. This one had a temper. He yelled constantly, smelled of alcohol, and viewed the boy as competition. The mother, desperate for approval, sided with her new partner. Any sign of protest was punished. The boy's personal space was invaded, his few belongings destroyed, and his fear dismissed. The domestic environment became a war zone. No locks on doors, no privacy, no peace. Studies in developmental criminology show that children exposed to chronic domestic conflict and rejection are significantly more likely to exhibit conduct disorders by age 12. He was already ahead of that curve. Then came the moment, the event that psychologists often refer to as the trigger point. It wasn't grand or cinematic. It was mundane, which made it all the more tragic. He was 10. He had been saving a toy from the trash, a small plastic dinosaur, the only object he associated with comfort. The man saw it, laughed, and smashed it in front of him. The boy didn't cry. He didn't scream. He just stared for hours. That night, something changed. It wasn't the destruction of the toy. It was the message behind it. Even the smallest attempt at joy would be punished. That night, he stopped asking for love altogether. The next morning, he didn't speak. For days, Selective mutism is often misunderstood. It's not stubbornness, it's psychological paralysis. He withdrew into himself and no one reached in. His school labeled him as difficult. His mother called him dramatic. The man mocked him. At night, he began collecting sharp objects. Not to hurt anyone, not yet. It was about control, about reclaiming a feeling of safety through objects that symbolized defense. The seeds of retaliatory violence had been planted. Soon, small animals started disappearing around the neighborhood. It was subtle, a missing bird, a neighbor's injured cat, nothing overt. But behind each disappearance was an act of experimentation, not with death, but with reaction. Would anyone notice? Would anyone care? No one did. And this reinforced the belief that life, whether his or someone else's, had no value unless someone felt its absence. This belief would later become central to his profile during psychological evaluations. His sense of identity became fused with the power to provoke consequence. The abuse didn't stop, it evolved. Less physical, more psychological. Mind games, lies, gaslighting, threats. Sometimes they'd lock him out of the house. Sometimes they'd pretend they forgot him at school. Each incident chipped away at any remaining belief that he mattered. His body grew, but his emotional development stalled. He became frozen at the age he first stopped receiving love. His expressions flattened. His interests narrowed. His eyes, once full of questions, were now empty. By 11, he began speaking again, not to adults, but to himself, whispering, narrating scenarios, practicing words he'd one day say in moments of confrontation. This internal dialogue, if interrupted, would provoke rage. Quiet rage at first, tight fists, clenched jaw, pacing. Then came the outbursts. Sudden, unprovoked attacks on furniture, walls, objects. The family labeled him unstable. The school labeled him disruptive. The system labeled him high risk. But no, one labeled him what he truly was, a child in crisis. And crisis, left untreated, becomes chaos. Not in one day, not in one act, but in accumulation. And for him, it was all accumulating, layer by layer, year by year. He didn't want to hurt anyone. He just wanted someone to stop hurting him. And when that didn't happen, when all pleas were ignored, his mind made a decision that his body would later follow. The world would finally see him, not as a child, not as a victim, but as a force that couldn't be ignored. And from that moment forward, everything began to shift. What had once been drawings became plans. What had once been silence became cold calculation. What had once been trauma became the engine of something darker. But that part of the story is only just beginning. Before you continue with this content that reveals the hidden side of human behavior, you need to check out the ebook Manipulation. Inside, you'll uncover the mechanisms behind mind control, behavioral influence, and the silent strategies used by people who manipulate their environment without being noticed. It's a true map of the mind. You'll learn how real psychological control techniques work and how some individuals camouflage, strike, and influence others while staying invisible. You need to take this knowledge to the next level, because in the psychological game, those who don't understand become pawns. After the video ends, open the link in the description and get the ebook. From the I have. Outside, nothing seemed drastically different. He still went to school. He still sat in the back. He still avoided eye contact. But inside, a new structure was forming. Not a repair of what had been broken, but the construction of something else entirely. Something colder, more efficient, more protected. This wasn't healing. This was adaptation. A dark, strategic psychological adaptation. In forensic psychology, this stage is often marked by the appearance of emotional numbing and instrumental thinking. The child learns that if vulnerability invites punishment, then detachment must offer safety. And in his case, detachment became everything. He stopped flinching, not because the pain had ceased, but because he no longer recognized it as unusual. Physical punishment became routine. Psychological humiliation turned into background noise. Instead of reacting with tears or fear, he began to respond with a stillness that unsettled even his abusers. This stillness was not peace. It was suppression, the kind that alters neurochemical responses, rewires emotional thresholds, and disconnects a child from both the fear of violence and the empathy that should accompany witnessing it. At just 11, he began to exhibit signs of what clinical studies classify as early-onset conduct disorder with antisocial traits. But there were no diagnoses, no evaluations, no one looking close enough. His notebooks, once filled with cryptic drawings of lonely figures, now displayed graphic, aggressive images. Weapons became central. The victims were vague, but their suffering was clear. He drew scenes of isolation, punishment, and control. Always control. He began adding captions in red ink, phrases like, "Stop screaming," or "This time, I decide." When asked about the drawings, he said they were just cartoons. But they weren't. They were rehearsal. They were the coded language of a child who had given up on being understood and now wanted to be feared. In child behavioral profiling, this kind of symbolic aggression is a key early indicator of a psychopathic trajectory. And yet, the drawings were dismissed. Just a boy being dark, a phase, a mood. Nobody asked where those images came from. His behavior at school became more volatile. Outbursts were sudden and sharp. He would throw objects across the room when frustrated, lash out when touched, laugh when others cried. Teachers marked him as defiant. Classmates avoided him. But again, the surface behavior obscured the deeper transformation. What the school saw as misbehavior was, in reality, a system of defense and domination evolving. He wasn't trying to belong anymore. He was trying to control his environment the only way he had learned, through unpredictability, threat, and emotional disconnection. He started watching people more than he spoke to them, studying facial reactions, testing how much he could say before they got scared, testing which expressions made them flinch. This was not curiosity. It was calibration. The beginning of a detached, analytical mindset often seen in juvenile offenders who develop sociopathic tendencies. He wasn't interested in friendships or games. He was interested in control, in consequence, in observing how others processed fear. At home, he became unnervingly calm, too calm. He cleaned more than usual. He answered in complete sentences. But when left alone, he whispered to himself, repeated phrases, and sometimes stood in front of mirrors without blinking. The pets in the house began to suffer. First, the dog stopped eating. Then, it disappeared. They said it ran away. But the boy's journal, found years later, had pages describing in vivid detail what he had done. It wasn't about hurting the dog. It was about what he felt afterward, or rather, what he didn't feel. No guilt, no sadness, just clarity. The act had not disturbed him. It had grounded him. In forensic child psychiatry, this absence of emotional remorse, combined with calculated cruelty, is a red flag for emerging sociopathy. He was no longer confused about who he was becoming. He was curious. He began isolating himself in the basement. There, he arranged objects with obsessive precision: tools, strings, pieces of metal, bits of broken toys, all lined up, symmetrical, monitored. This wasn't play. This was a ritual. Ritualization is a coping mechanism for children trying to impose structure on internal chaos. But in criminal development, it's also a predictor of compulsive future behavior. He wasn't just surviving anymore. He was structuring an internal logic, one where he had power, control, and the freedom to rehearse harm without consequences. When the cat next door vanished, no one suspected him. He had been behaving, quiet, distant, but not disruptive. He wore long sleeves, even in the heat, to hide scratches. His mother praised him for finally growing up, but he wasn't growing. He was withdrawing into a mental space completely cut off from human connection, a place where others were objects, pain was useful, and emotions were liabilities. In his mind, the world had made its rules clear. The weak are ignored, the silent are forgotten, and the visible are punished. So he chose to become invisible in plain sight. Psychological evaluations conducted later described his expressions as flat, voice monotonous, eye contact minimal, but intense. He often gave answers that were technically correct, but lacked any emotional resonance. When asked about childhood events, he responded with factual recall and zero affect. No anger, no sorrow, just statements. This affective flattening is a hallmark of emotional detachment and is frequently seen in case studies of youth with callous, unemotional traits. He wasn't suppressing his emotions. He had lost the reference for them. What remained was calculation. When provoked, his reactions weren't explosive. They were targeted. He began sabotaging other children quietly, breaking their pencils, hiding their belongings, spreading lies to isolate them, not for revenge, but for the experiment. He wanted to see what would happen. The adults remained oblivious, or perhaps they chose not to care. Teachers said he was strange but manageable. His mother called him moody. The man in the house avoided him altogether now, sensing something had changed, but unable to name it. There's a term in developmental psychology for this stage: social camouflage. The child learns to mimic normalcy just enough to avoid intervention, and in doing so, they perfect the ability to blend in while nurturing deviance beneath the surface. He stopped drawing on paper. Instead, he began carving into furniture, into walls, symbols, names, abstract shapes, sometimes just lines crossed through other lines. There was no direct message, but there was purpose, marking territory, leaving signals, tracing thoughts. Some were found etched into his school desk years later, patterns eerily similar to those later connected to his first crime. Scene. He was encoding himself into the environment, testing how much of his inner world he could externalize before anyone noticed. No one ever did. He had one last interaction with a classmate that stood out. A girl had dropped her notebook, and he picked it up. She smiled at him, said thank you. He stared at her for several seconds without responding, then walked away. That night, he ripped out pages from his own notebooks, not out of rage, out of confusion. That one moment of kindness had disrupted the narrative he had built about the world. For a second, he was unsure. Then he remembered the toy, the bruises, the silence, the shattered dog bowl, and just like that, the confusion faded, replaced by clarity. From that day forward, he stopped hoping to be seen as good, stopped fantasizing about being rescued. His drawings were burned, his journals hidden, his voice reduced to necessity only. Inside, something had solidified, not a decision, a conclusion, a psychological finality that took years to fully manifest, but was already carved into his developing neural map. He didn't want love anymore. He wanted control, and he was willing to do whatever it took to get it. And this was only the beginning of what he would become. It didn't happen suddenly. The transition from emotional numbness to physical violence was not a dramatic explosion, but a quiet, inevitable slide. Like a thread pulled for too long, it finally snapped, but without noise. In criminal profiling, this stage is often misunderstood. The first act of violence committed by a psychologically detached minor is not always a cry for help, nor is it always a calculated plan. Sometimes, it is both. And in his case, it was the outcome of everything that had come before: abuse, rejection, silence, humiliation, and a growing fascination with consequence. That fascination had matured into fixation. The only thing left was opportunity. It was a Thursday, a day like any other. He walked to school under the same overcast sky that had shaded most of his childhood. The teachers said he was quiet, as usual. The students barely acknowledged his presence, but inside, his mind was running scripts. That morning, he had written 3 lines in his hidden notebook. One was a question, one was a name, one was an instruction. He tore the page out and folded it into his pocket. These were not the words of a child planning revenge. They were the words of someone testing what was possible. The trigger came from a boy 2 years older, a known bully, someone who had often targeted him with mockery. That day, the boy tripped him in the hallway, called him a ghost, said his mother should have left him in a dumpster. A line, a familiar one, but this time, something broke. It wasn't rage, it wasn't humiliation, it was clarity. A cold, surgical decision formed in his mind, and for the first time in his life, he smiled. During lunch, he approached the older boy alone. No one saw them leave. They walked toward the side of the schoolyard near the maintenance shed. It was an area often empty, shielded from direct view. Surveillance footage would later show them disappearing behind a fence at 12:07. What happened in the next 5 minutes would mark the irreversible transformation from victim to perpetrator. The tool he used was not brought from home. It was improvised. A metal rod he had found behind the shed days earlier and hidden. The strike was sudden, aimed at the temple, followed by 2 more to the jaw and side. No screaming, no struggle. According to forensic analysis, the attack lasted no more than 30 seconds. The boy collapsed. The killer stood over him, staring, not running, not panicking. Later reports from crime scene investigators described his stance as composed, almost indifferent. He placed the rod next to the body, walked out, returned to class, sat down. He didn't speak for the rest of the day. When the missing student alert was issued, he showed no reaction. When questioned by staff, he said he hadn't seen anything. But the surveillance footage told the story he wouldn't. And when the police arrived, he didn't resist, didn't cry, didn't deny, just sat, waiting. In the interrogation room, his voice was steady, his answers were short. He asked only one question: what happens now? This emotional detachment during and after a violent act is consistent with early psychopathic development. The absence of remorse, the calculated control, the measured detachment. These are not traits of a child unaware of his actions. They are traits of a mind that has stopped valuing consequence in the emotional sense and sees it only through the lens of structure and response. Psychological evaluations conducted in the days that followed revealed several key traits aligned with conduct disorder with limited prosocial emotions, a diagnosis often used to describe youth with severe empathy deficits. He didn't express sorrow. He didn't express pride. He simply explained. The victim was a problem. The moment was an answer. He didn't hate him. He didn't feel anything at all. The media reacted swiftly. A child had killed another child. Headlines framed him as a monster, a cold-blooded killer, a product of moral decay. There was no space for nuance, no space for trauma. The public wanted answers, but only the kind that fit their outrage. They wanted punishment, not understanding. Yet behind the scenes, forensic psychologists and legal professionals struggled to define him. Was he a sociopath in formation? A product of systemic failure? A tragic inevitability? In courtroom reports, his demeanor was described as robotic. He didn't fidget. He didn't blink excessively. He maintained eye contact only when directly addressed. Several professionals noted the flatness of his affect. He was present, but emotionally absent. As one psychologist noted, he behaved like someone observing his own trial from the outside. This psychological distancing is not uncommon among young offenders with developmental trauma and emerging personality disorders. It's not that he didn't know what he did. He knew. He just didn't feel it the way others expected him to. One of the most telling moments occurred during a psychiatric evaluation. He was asked to describe the day of the crime in detail. He did so with precision, times, movements, actions. But when asked what he thought the victim felt, he paused, not because he was reflecting, but because he genuinely didn't know. He guessed. Not based on empathy, but logic. Maybe fear, maybe pain, but he wasn't sure. This absence of emotional imagination is often found in young individuals with disrupted mirror neuron activity, commonly linked to psychopathic traits. He wasn't devoid of intelligence. He was devoid of connection. His mother's reaction was fractured. In front of the press, she cried. In private, she blamed the system, then blamed herself, then him. Her testimony was filled with contradictions, love and regret laced with resentment. She said she always knew something was wrong, that he wasn't like other children. But she never said why she never asked for help, never explained the broken furniture, the missing pets, the drawings. Denial is a common defense mechanism in parents of violent offenders, especially when the warning signs were clear and ignored. It's easier to call it a sudden change than to admit it was years in the making. Professionals from multiple disciplines were brought in to analyze the case. Neurologists, psychologists, behavioral analysts. Each had a piece of the puzzle. Some cited early trauma, others focused on environmental neglect. A few proposed genetic predisposition. But no single narrative could capture the complexity of what he had become, because what he had become was not just the result of one factor. It was a convergence of silence, cruelty, indifference, and unmet need. And once those forces aligned, the outcome was not a matter of if, but when. The community response was immediate and polarized. Some demanded he be tried as an adult. Others called for mental health intervention. Many simply wanted to forget. But forgetting wasn't possible. Not when the victim's family lived 3 blocks away. Not when the killer's empty desk sat untouched for weeks. Not when every parent in that school now looked at their child's classmates with quiet suspicion. The ripple effect of child-on-child homicide is unique in its terror. It challenges the core belief that childhood is a protected space, that innocence is guaranteed by age. In follow-up evaluations, he remained consistent. No remorse, no change. When asked if he would do it again, he didn't say yes. He said it would depend on the situation, on the person, on whether it felt necessary. That answer would later be cited in hearings, sparking debates about his capacity for rehabilitation. But to those who had been watching from the beginning, to the investigators, the psychologists, the few teachers who remembered the drawings, it wasn't surprising. And in the silence that followed the final gavel, as he was escorted out of the courtroom and into the facility where he would spend the next years of his life, there was no outburst, no breakdown. He walked in silence, just as he had always done. And yet, something had shifted. Not in him, in the world, watching him. Because now, finally, they saw him, not as a child, not as a tragedy, but as a consequence, a mirror they never wanted to face. And it was in that reflection that the next chapter would begin. He was just one boy, one among thousands, and yet his silence became a scream loud enough to fracture an entire community. In courtrooms, in living rooms, in classrooms where children once doodled without fear, his name echoed. But now that the act was done, now that the first crime was committed, society finally looked at him, not with empathy, not with understanding, but with terror. A terror rooted not in who he was, but in the reflection he offered. Because to look at him was to look at everything we refused to see, every ignored red flag, every silent cry, every institution that passed him along, every adult who said he would grow out of it, every system that offered structure but never affection, every moment where intervention was replaced with avoidance. And that is where the truth begins to rot, not in the crime itself, but in the apathy that allowed it to be born. Criminal psychology does not exist to justify behavior like his. It exists to explain it, dissect it, and reveal the environment in which it took root. When we talk about the development of sociopathy in childhood, we are not just talking about the child. We are talking about everyone around him, the scaffolding of neglect, the normalization of pain, the invisible contracts between adults who choose comfort over confrontation, who fear what they might uncover if they dig too deep into a child's emotional world. He was not born broken. None of them are. That's the first myth society clings to because it's easier than accountability. It's easier to believe in inherent evil than to examine how long someone can endure being unloved before they lose the ability to feel love themselves. He was labeled too late, observed too late, diagnosed only after damage became irreversible. The professionals who came in post-crime saw the profile, saw the flattened affect, saw the callous, unemotional traits. But what if they had been there earlier? What if someone had taken the drawing seriously? What if the whispers had been questioned? What if the bruises had been believed? What if someone had understood that cruelty to animals is not just disturbing, but diagnostic? This is where prevention begins. Not in punishment, not in prison, but in perception. In being willing to ask the uncomfortable questions before tragedy makes the answers obvious. There were moments, many of them, when intervention could have been life-changing. But no one wants to be the person who confronts a parent about their child's behavior. No one wants to challenge the idea that a quiet kid might not just be shy, but dissociating. That behind the silence there might be calculations forming. That behind the politeness, there may be manipulation. That behind the absence of tantrums, there may be the absence of empathy. The early signs are rarely dramatic. They are often subtle, but they are there. They are always there. Behavioral science has shown us that children do not develop violent tendencies in isolation. It is a cumulative process, a symphony of unmet needs, of emotional injury, of environments that teach survival instead of safety. Children mirror what they see. If they see dominance rewarded, they will seek control. If they see vulnerability punished, they will bury their feelings. If they see their pain ignored, they will assume it has no value, and eventually, they may believe that no one's pain matters. That is not born from evil. That is born from emotional starvation, from the kind of deprivation that doesn't leave visible scars, but dismantles the architecture of empathy before it can even fully form. His story is not isolated. It is not rare. And that is the most frightening part. There are more like him, right now, in classrooms, on playgrounds, in bedrooms filled with silence, children who stare too long, children who never cry, children who laugh when others get hurt, children who do not respond to affection, who do not react to praise, who draw things they can't explain, who act out only when they know no one is watching. These are not bad kids. These are disconnected kids. And disconnection, when left unchecked, can metastasize into something unrecognizable. Society is quick to call for justice, to demand harsher sentences, stricter schools, more metal detectors, more medication. But what it rarely demands is introspection. What it rarely examines is the root, the early days, the first signs, the emotional language that never developed. The trauma response is misread as rebellion, the teachers who wanted to help but had 30 others to manage, the parents who did their best but were never taught how to recognize psychological distress in their own child, the psychologists whose referrals were ignored, the neighbors who heard the screaming and turned up the volume on the television. The systems that failed him were not hidden. They were all in plain sight. We must ask ourselves, what kind of childhood creates the capacity to kill without remorse? Not to romanticize it, not to sensationalize it, but to understand it. Because understanding is the only bridge to prevention. He was not invisible because he was quiet. He was invisible because it was convenient, because acknowledging him would require effort. And now, society has made the effort, but it's too late. The damage has already shaped him, and no amount of prison time, no sentence, no diagnosis can undo that. Psychology teaches us that the human brain is most malleable in the early years. That intervention during key developmental windows can alter trajectories. That emotional regulation, empathy, and attachment can be nurtured if someone is present, if someone notices, if someone decides that it's worth asking why a child never makes eye contact, or why a 10-year-old never shows frustration, or why a 12-year-old doesn't flinch at blood. These questions are uncomfortable. They force us to reevaluate our own roles, our own thresholds for discomfort, our own silence. And now here we are, looking back at a story already written, an outcome already sealed, a life already redirected. But it didn't have to be. That is the truth no one wants to say out loud. It didn't have to be. There was time, there were signs, there were options, but what there wasn't was action. And that absence echoes louder than the crime itself. Because if we do not learn from it, if we do not change the way we see and respond to emotional distress in children, then we are not just observers, we are participants, silent collaborators in the creation of another cold, calculating mind that believes love is a myth and that pain is the only reliable currency. So we ask the question not just to provoke, but to challenge. Are we creating more like him every day? With every ignored red flag, with every child dismissed as difficult, with every system that prioritizes performance over well-being, with every adult too tired to ask why, are we, without realizing it, planting seeds of violence in the soil of indifference? This isn't just about him anymore. It never was. It's about all the ones we haven't seen yet, all the ones still drawing in silence, still waiting, still becoming.